Ever get that feeling like you're drowning in information? You just want to cut to the chase, get to the heart of the matter.
Right, right. Totally. We're all so busy and there's just so much coming at us from all sides.
Exactly. So that's kind of the mission here in this deep dive. We're going to zero in on this this fascinating intersection.
Tell me more. Lay it on me.
Okay, so we're looking at how some really basic, fundamental human rights and constitutional rights too, how they might actually be linked. And then, and this is where it gets really interesting, how their violation could potentially connect to actual crimes in the Colombian Penal Code.
Crimes. Wow. Okay. Heavy stuff. Which ones are we talking about specifically?
We're primarily focusing on two, estafa,
Yeah.
which you can think of as fraud or swindling.
Yeah.
And then prevaricato por omission, which is essentially when a public official kind of drops the ball, neglects their duty by not taking action when they should.
I see. So we're going deep, really deep into this connection between rights violations and criminal offenses in Colombia.
Exactly. And to do that, we're going to be really dissecting some pretty compelling source material.
All right, let's hear it. What have we got?
We've got this YouTube video transcript. Title is a mouthful, but it basically translates to violation of human rights 2717 and so on, and constitutional rights 2340, 22 and so on, with fraud and prevarication by omission. It was uploaded to a channel called Pazzi Fram, Peace is a Right and Mandatory Duty, recorded just yesterday, April 4th, 2025.
Wow, that's a recent one. And anything else we're working with?
Yep, there's also this supplementary text file, same basic title and meeting details, so another perspective on the same core issues.
Got it. So just to be clear, we're diving into the arguments and perspectives specifically within these sources, right? Not necessarily saying we agree or disagree with everything.
Exactly. Just trying to really understand the chain of thought being laid out here,
Makes sense. Okay, so which specific rights are we talking about here? You mentioned a whole bunch of numbers.
Right. So we've got Human Right 27, which is all about the right to participate in scientific progress and benefit from it. Not just for scientists, for everyone. Tuta persona, as they say in the transcript.
Interesting. Everyone gets a piece of the scientific pie. I like it. What else?
Then there's Colombian Constitutional Right 23, which guarantees the right to petition authorities and get a real solid response. It's actually backed up by Law 1755, too.
Okay, so there are legal teeth to that right to petition. Interesting.
Yep. We're also looking at Human Right 17, the right to own property, both individually and collectively. Colombian Constitutional Right 40, particularly that fifth paragraph about citizen initiatives. And last but not least, Colombian Constitutional Right 22, which says peace is both a right and a mandatory duty.
Wow, that's a lot of rights on the table. So where do we even begin to connect all these dots?
Well, the heart of it, at least as the source lays it out, is that a violation of one of these rights, especially Human Right 27, doesn't just stop there. There's this ripple effect.
A ripple effect, huh? Meaning that a violation of one right could trigger a cascade, potentially affecting other rights as well. That's a pretty powerful claim.
It is, and that's exactly what we're digging into. The argument is that this violation of Human Right 27, that basic right to be part of scientific progress, could actually lead to the violation of all these other rights we just talked about.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. But what does that have to do with estafa and prevaricato? How does the source link those crimes to this whole rights violation thing?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a pretty complex argument, but it's fascinating. So to break it down, we got to start with Human Right 27 itself. What's at its core? What does it really mean, according to the source material?
All right, let's get down to brass tacks. So Human Right 27, as they emphasize in the video, has this key phrase, to the persona. Everyone, right? It's not just for the scientists in their labs, it's a universal right. Everyone has the right to be involved, to participate in scientific progress, and to share in whatever benefits come out of it.
Yeah, it's not just about the discoveries themselves, right? It's about everyone having the chance to contribute and potentially benefit. Like a real sense of ownership over scientific progress.
Absolutely. That's where this whole petitioning thing comes in, right?
Yeah.
How does the source connect this big, broad right to participate in science with that specific Colombian Constitutional Right 23, the right to petition?
Well, they argue that participating in science naturally leads to people proposing ideas, asking questions, seeking out the relevant authorities to engage with.
So it's like a natural progression, a natural extension of the right to participate. You have ideas, you want to share them, you want to be part of the conversation.
Exactly. And that's where Colombian Constitutional Right 23 kicks in. It guarantees that every individual has the right to bring those petitions to the authorities. and not just any petition, a respectful one, of course, but they're entitled to a prompt, thorough, and substantive response. Law 1755 really emphasizes this.
So it's not enough to just acknowledge receipt of the petition, right? The authorities have an obligation to actually engage with the substance of what's being presented.
Exactly. The source argues that if you're going to have this right to participate in science, then you got to have the right to have your scientific inquiries, your proposals, your ideas heard and seriously considered. That's the link.
I'm following you. So what happens when those petitions, especially ones focused on scientific hypotheses or methods, new ideas, what happens when they're just ignored or the response is totally superficial, like a brush off?
Well, the source says that's a double violation. Not only are you undermining that universal right to participate in science, Human Right 27, but you're also disrespecting that constitutional right to have your petition addressed properly, Colombian Constitutional Right 23, a 2-for-1 violation, if you will.
Yikes. Not good. Does the source offer any specific examples to back this up? Because that's a pretty serious accusation.
Oh, yeah, they do. They point to a pretty staggering number of unanswered proposals, starting with the number 1 and going all the way to 209, all directly related to scientific progress.
Wow, 209 unanswered proposals. That's a lot. Seems like more than just a coincidence.
Right. The source presents this as clear evidence that there's a systemic problem here, that it's not just an isolated oversight, but a pattern of failing to uphold these fundamental rights.
Makes you wonder what's behind that. What are the ramifications of just ignoring these proposals? Why does the source make such a big deal out of it?
Well, they argue that by not providing a space, a platform for these hypotheses to be tested, validated, refuted, or even just improved upon, you're basically putting the brakes on scientific progress itself.
It's like you're stopping the flow of ideas, the natural evolution of knowledge.
Right. And these ideas, they could hold the key to solving problems, to bringing about societal benefits, driving innovation, but they're being left to collect dust. That's why the source sees it as a direct violation of Human Right 27, because it prevents people from both participating in and benefiting from scientific advancement. It's about stifled potential, lost opportunities.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got the rights violation piece, but how in the world does this get connected to estafa, to fraud?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. It's a more nuanced argument. But the source tries to link this lack of response to the petitions and this resulting stifling of scientific progress to the crime of estafa, as defined under Article 246 of the Colombian Penal Code.
So they're basically saying that inaction, that not responding, can be a form of deception, and a harmful one at that.
That's the gist of it. They're reframing this inaction as potentially criminal.
But before we go too far down that road, let's just refresh our memory here. What exactly is estafa in this context? How does the source define it legally? Okay, good point. Let's get the legal stuff straight. So, according to the source, estafa happens when someone gets an illegal gain for themselves, or maybe for a third party, by intentionally misleading someone or keeping them in the dark through some kind of deception, tricks, things like that. And that deception ends up hurting the other person. So it's about the illegal gain, the trickery, and the harm that results. Those are the key elements.
You need all three. Someone's got to benefit illegally, there's got to be some kind of deception involved, and someone's got to be worse off because of it.
Yeah, it's a pretty specific set of conditions. So how do these ignored scientific proposals fit into that definition of fraud? It seems like a bit of a stretch.
It does, but the source makes a case. Their argument is that when you intentionally don't respond to these proposals, especially the ones that aim to benefit a wider community, not just one person, you're keeping the person who made the proposal, and maybe even the public as a whole, in a state of uncertainty.
It's like keeping them hanging.
Yeah.
In limbo.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
They don't know if their ideas are good, if they'd work, if they could make a difference. And even worse, they might be missing out on potential improvements, solutions to problems, while other people are maybe potentially unfairly benefiting because those solutions aren't being implemented.
Okay. So it's not just about the lack of a response. It's about who might be gaining from that silence, from that inaction. It starts to feel a bit more deliberate, a bit less innocent.
Right. It's like a deliberate withholding of information.
Yeah.
Holding back progress for someone's potential gain. And the source even uses this interesting term, estafatones.
Estafatones, what's that all about? Haven't heard that one before.
Yeah, it seems to be a term they kind of coined themselves. Basically, they're describing a situation where this fraud, this estafa, is happening on a huge scale, systemically. It's not just one-off cases of ignoring proposals. It's this pattern of behavior that adds up to a sort of massive collective swindle.
Like a whole network of deception, all based on inaction. Wow.
Exactly. The idea is that the public is being deprived of these potential benefits because of this deliberate obstruction. So, to bring back to the sources argument, they're suggesting that by ignoring these petitions, especially ones that could benefit society as a whole, while others might be gaining unfairly from that lack of progress, it could be interpreted as a form of estafa.
That's a pretty bold statement. It certainly reframes the whole issue of bureaucratic inaction in a new light. It's not just inefficiency, it's potentially criminal.
That's the argument being made. Okay, so we've tackled estafa. Now, let's move on to prevaricado por omission. What is that, and how does the source connect it to these ignored petitions and lack of action?
All right, let's untangle prevaricado por omission. So, as defined in Article 414 of the Colombian Penal Code, which the source references, it basically means that a public official, someone working for the government, isn't doing their job. They're intentionally failing to fulfill their duties.
So it's about knowingly neglecting their responsibilities, not just making a mistake or being a little slow.
Right, it's got to be deliberate. They're either outright refusing to do something they're supposed to do, delaying it without a good reason, or just completely omitting it, like it never even crossed their mind. The key is that they have a duty to act legally, and they choose not to.
So it's about inaction, but a very specific kind of inaction, one that's tied to their official responsibilities. How does the source apply this to the situation with the unanswered petitions? How do they link it to public officials?
Well, they argue that certain public officials, specifically fiscals, judges, and magistrates, might be committing prevaricado por omission when they don't take action on reported rights violations, or when they don't give real substantive responses to those petitions.
Because it's their job to respond to these concerns, to take action on potential violations.
Exactly. They have a legal obligation to address these issues. And by failing to do so, they're potentially neglecting their responsibilities, which could fall under prevaricado por omission. It's about not doing what they're supposed to do, and that not doing has consequences.
The source specifically mentions the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation in this context. What's their argument there?
They basically claim that this ministry isn't doing enough to support scientific development in Colombia, that it's not fulfilling its responsibilities in that area.
They don't just make a vague accusation, though, do they? Don't they have some kind of evidence to support that claim?
Oh, yeah, they do. They mentioned doing a search for the word prevaricar in relation to the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation, and they claim they found 41 videos, which they present as evidence that there's a pretty widespread public perception that this ministry is failing to do its job, particularly when it comes to investing in science and technology.
41 videos. That's a pretty significant number. Suggests that this concern isn't just coming from one isolated person. But do they get into any specific examples of prevaricado within the ministry? Or is it just a general accusation?
No, they do give a specific example. They talk about the problem of budget stagnation in public universities, which has been going on for a while. And they mention a proposal for a simulator, like a computer program that could simulate state and non-renewable resources that was proposed as a way to help with these financial challenges.
A simulator, huh? Interesting. But what does that have to do with prevaricado?
Well, the source's argument is that by not even considering this proposal, by not responding to it or engaging with it in any meaningful way, the ministry or the officials within the ministry are failing in their duty to support and advance relevant scientific solutions.
They had a potential solution presented to them and they just ignored it.
Exactly. And the source argues that ignoring a proposal like that, something that could have a positive impact, could potentially be considered prevaricado. It's like they had a chance to do something good, something helpful, and they just didn't.
They also mention a personal experience of trying to offer their services to the state to help improve productivity. What's the story there? How does that fit into this whole prevaricado thing?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. They basically say they proposed working for the state, and they were even willing to do it for minimum wage. Their goal was to help make things more efficient, more productive. They draw a comparison to the U.S., where they claim there's a government department specifically focused on efficiency, and it saved taxpayers a ton of money.
So they're basically saying, look, I'm willing to help. I have the skills. Let me contribute.
Exactly. But they didn't get a response or any real consideration. And they argue that this continued lack of response, this inaction on proposals that could potentially improve things, save money, make the government run better, contributes to prevaricado by those public officials.
It's like they're passing up a chance to make things better.
Right. It's about neglecting opportunities, failing to act when there are potentially positive actions they could be taking. So we've seen how the source connects the alleged violation of Human Right 27, that right to participate in science, and the right to petition, to estafa and prevaricado. But what about those other rights we talked about earlier, like the right to peace? How do those fit into all of this?
That's a great question. The source argues that by blocking scientific progress, by ignoring these potential solutions, they're actually hindering the achievement of peace. And they specifically call out hypotheses for peace, even mentioning one led by victims of conflict, as examples of ideas that are being shut down.
Interesting. So not just any scientific progress, but specifically progress that could contribute to peace.
Exactly. And since Colombian Constitutional Right 22 establishes peace not only as a right, but also as a mandatory duty for the state, they're saying that this obstruction is making it much harder for the state to actually fulfill that duty.
If you're not even exploring potential solutions, you're not really upholding your duty to strive for peace. Is that what they're saying?
That's their argument. It's about neglecting potential paths to peace, shutting down ideas before they can even be explored. What about the right to citizen initiatives, Colombian Constitutional Right 40, particularly that fifth paragraph? How does that get affected?
Their main point there is that tons of citizen initiatives, proposals, ideas from the people are being submitted, but they're being ignored. No one's really looking at them, and they're certainly not being evaluated scientifically, which goes back to those violations of Human Right 27 and the right to petition.
So it's not just that they're not implementing these ideas, it's that they're not even giving them a fair hearing, a proper evaluation.
Exactly. By failing to consider these proposals, these citizen-led initiatives, by not giving them a scientific assessment, they're undermining the right of citizens to have their voices heard, their ideas for improving things taken seriously. It's like they're saying, your ideas don't matter.
And what about the right to property? Human Right 17, the one that includes collective property. How does that enter the picture?
The source argues that because of all this inaction, all this ignoring of proposals, the public is being denied the potential benefits that could come from scientific progress. Things like, let's say, efficient digital government software, or better ways of managing natural resources.
So it's not about someone taking away your house or your car. It's about depriving the public of potential advancements that could benefit everyone.
Right. It's about the denial of a collective good, a shared benefit that could improve everyone's lives. And that, they argue, could be seen as a violation of the right to collective property. They even mention offering to donate software and suggest creating a public-private entity to manage it.
So they're not just complaining, they're offering solutions, trying to be proactive. It's really interesting how they connect this to the national budget and those laws about accessing public information, too.
Right. They point out how much of the budget goes to operating costs and paying off debt, leaving a much smaller portion for actual investment in things that could improve the country. They argue that there's this proposed budget management simulator that could help optimize how the money's being used, which could lead to better outcomes for everyone.
So they're saying, hey, we could be using our resources much more effectively, but because of omission, this failure to act, we're missing out.
Exactly. And they also complain that those public information access laws, the ones from 2022 and 2014, aren't being respected in this situation. They're saying the government isn't being transparent about WHY. They're not acting on these proposals. WHY, they're making the budgetary decisions they are. It's a lack of transparency on top of a lack of action.
They also raise concerns about this public contracting system, ESICOP. What's the issue there?
The source mentions a SEC tender, which is basically a public bidding process for government contracts worth a whopping 24 billion pesos. And their concern is that because they're not using a scientific approach, one that's based on user research, something they claim to have expertise in, there's a huge risk that all that money won't be used efficiently. It's like they're saying, hey, you're not using the best tools available to make sure this money is being spent wisely.
And that ultimately hurts the public because that's public money that's potentially being wasted.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fascinating connection how this lack of scientific input could lead to a misuse of collective resources, which ties back to that right to collective property.
Right. It's all connected. It's this chain reaction. And then toward the end of the transcript, the source makes this call for a global network of victims. What's that about?
Yeah, that's a powerful statement. They're calling for a network of individuals who feel they've been harmed by the inaction or negligence of, specifically, fiscals, judges, and magistrates. people who feel the legal system has failed them.
Interesting. So they're trying to broaden the idea of who qualifies as a victim. It's not just about victims of violence or crime in the traditional sense, but also victims of this alleged systemic failure to uphold rights, to address potential wrongdoing.
Right. They connect it to the Day of Remembrance and Solidarity with victims of the armed conflict in Colombia, which is coming up on April 9th.
Oh, right. A very significant day in Colombia.
And they're saying that the definition of victim and even the idea of conflict needs to be expanded. It's not just about armed conflict. It's also about these other forms of harm, these injustices that people suffer because the authorities aren't doing their job, aren't protecting their rights.
Makes you think about all the different ways people can be harmed, all the different forms of injustice that exist. Powerful stuff.
Absolutely. The source also gets personal, sharing some of their own experiences with obstruction, how they feel like they've been personally wronged in their interactions with different entities.
Yeah, like that part where they talk about being excluded from meetings just for trying to advocate for their rights, to contribute to peace. And that whole thing about the proposal they submitted to a political movement, which was apparently accepted and then just disappeared.
It's like they hit a wall everywhere they turned. They tried to participate, to contribute, and they felt blocked at every step.
And they see these personal experiences as examples of the larger systemic problems they're trying to highlight. It's like their own individual story becomes a microcosm of the broader issue.
It adds a human dimension to this whole complex discussion of rights violations and legal arguments. So we've covered a lot. Could you sum up the key points, the core arguments that the source is making about all these interconnected rights and potential crimes?
Sure. They're basically arguing that failing to respect that fundamental human right to participate in scientific progress, particularly when it's coupled with not responding to citizen petitions in a real substantial way, sets off a chain reaction.
Like a domino effect, one thing leads to another.
Exactly. And they're saying this initial violation, this ignoring of people's right to participate and have their voices heard, can then lead to criminal offenses, specifically estafa and prevaricato por omission by those officials who have a duty to act and aren't doing so. And then, to make matters worse, they argue that all this inaction ends up having a negative impact on a whole bunch of other basic rights, including the right to peace, the right to participate through citizen initiatives, and even the right to collective property and well-being.
So it's not just about one right being violated. It's this ripple effect that touches on so many aspects of society, so many fundamental rights.
Right. And the real mind blower is how they connect these seemingly separate issues, how they link these rights, our right to be part of scientific progress, our right to petition the government, our rights to peace, property, participation, how they argue that they're all intertwined, interconnected. And what's even more surprising is how they frame this whole thing within the context of criminal law in Colombia. It's a bold argument.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? About what happens when a system doesn't listen to its citizens, when it ignores their ideas, their concerns, especially when those ideas could lead to progress, to solutions, to a better future.
Absolutely. It raises some serious questions about the role of government, the responsibility of those in power, and the potential consequences when that responsibility is neglected.
And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listeners. Think about what it means to live in a system where people's ideas, their efforts to contribute, especially in areas like science and technology that hold so much potential for positive change, are met with silence, with inaction. What does that say about a society? What does it mean for innovation, for good governance, for the very rule of law? Could this pattern of no response, no action, as we've explored today, really amount to the crimes of estafa and prevaricato por omission? And if so, what happens if those interpretations are pursued legally, if they're upheld in a court of law? It's a lot to unpack, a lot to ponder, but these are questions worth asking, questions that might lead us to a deeper understanding of the complex relationship between individual rights, government responsibility, and the pursuit of progress.
Food for thought indeed.
That's it for this deep dive. Until next time.